Greetings, students. Welcome back to Chapter 5, Keywords and Concepts. We're moving on with taste, senses, perception, all the things. All right, so the first thing on this one that we need to know about is the auditory cortex. And this is the part of your brain that's in the temporal lobe that sound is sent to for processing. You have a nice little section of your brain designed just for your ears. Moving on to other kinds of senses, we have two chemical senses, right? We have taste, otherwise known as gustation, and smell, otherwise known as olfaction. And these are called chemical senses because both of them have sensory receptors that respond to molecules in the food we eat or the air we breathe, specifically chemicals in that. Remember, guys, water is a chemical. The chemicals aren't necessarily bad, they're just a thing. So these are called chemical senses because of the chemicals that need to be involved in order for us to actually process that information. And then moving on to touch, we have touch receptors. So these are nerve endings all over our bodies, right? Which respond to a variety of different types of touch stimuli. And they serve as sensory receptors for both thermoception. This is temperature perception, so whether or not it's cold or hot, right? And nociception, and this is a signal indicating potential harm and maybe pain. These receptors are really important, right? We need to know if we are in pain so that we can stop doing whatever it is that we're doing to hurt our bodies. Pain is useful. It tells us we're doing something wrong or bad. So those are the types of touch receptors that we're learning about. And then finally, in this little section here, we have the vestibular sense, which contributes to our ability to maintain balance and body posture. And you're kind of like, well, that's super. What do you mean by that? So do an imaginary experiment for me. If you stand up and you lift one leg up and you close your eyes, can you balance? It might take you a minute or two, but I bet you can. And you know why you can? Because of your vestibular sense. It keeps you grounded even when you're not necessarily looking at something. It's quite fun, actually. All right, moving on. So we only are just now touching on Gestalt psychology in this chapter. So the word Gestalt literally means a form or a pattern. But its use reflects the idea that the whole is different than the sum of the parts, right? So in other words, our brain does more with the sensory inputs than would be logical, right? It's more simply than the sum of the available parts. So have you ever seen those brain teasers that you can look at and it looks like a crooked line, but when you look at it, it looks smooth? That kind of thing, right? Your brain does things to fill in the blanks that you necessarily can't see. So we have a couple of different ideas around Gestalt Gestology here. The first one's proximity. And this is the idea that we tend to think that if things are close to one another, they're together, they're a group. I believe your textbook uses the idea of flying birds. Those birds may not be together, guys, but we see them together and we're like, oh, a flock of birds. There's also the law of continuity or good continuation. This is the idea that we're more likely to perceive continuous, smooth, flowing lines rather than jagged, broken lines. If you've ever seen those brain teasers where it's a sentence, but the bottom half of the sentence is missing and you can still read the sentence, yeah, law of continuity. And then the principle of closure states that we organize our perceptions into complete objects rather than as a series of parts. So we're going to have a tendency to look at something. Let's say you have a bunch of stuff, just random stuff. It could be whatever you have lying around in your house, video games, crafting supplies, gardening tools, whatever. Have you ever looked at a group of things and said, it kind of looks like an old man? Or, it kind of looks like a dragon. That's principle of closure, right? Our brains are trying to make sense of things that don't necessarily make sense. And there's lots of good fun with this to be had, especially with those brain teasers. But that's just kind of a brief look into Gestalt psychology.